A glance in the mirror. Chapter 5. Kidnapped. Babies at the turn of the century were not often weaned until they were at least 1 year old. Mothers were not expected to give up breastfeeding, for it was cheaper and more convenient to carry on. Babies kept in long gowns, and nothing done to disturb or excite them. They were not allowed to sit up until the age of at least 6 months. Their prams had large wheels, high sides, and fully sprung. Trying to help the child to walk before the age of 2 was frowned on, because it was thought the child would become bow-legged. In summer, many of the children went to the London parks. As most children were from large families, the eldest daughter kept an eye on the younger ones. Their owners pushed the prams, some hired and others pushed by the nanny. Picnics were held beneath the trees or by the lakeside. Drinking water was provided at the fountain. Ducks fed on scraps of stale bread, and peacocks gazed at it in awe. Bert was reminded by his brothers that when he was a toddler they returned home without him. They had forgotten him. He was quite innocently trotting off in another direction. A chimney sweep saw him apparently all alone, picked him up, placed him on his barrow amongst all the brushes and bags of soot, and then made off with him. His brothers, meanwhile, had reached home, still engrossed in conversation, to find him not bringing up the rear. There was panic at home, and his mother ran up to the park, frantically searching for him. The slums of Notting Hill, which is on the other side of the park, had an evil reputation for kidnapping and extortion, and it was because of this reputation that the mother made her way there. Fortunately, she found her son Bert placed on the barrow, parked outside a public house. The sweep was celebrating his successful abduction inside the inn. Sweeps and slum factory owners wanted cheap labour, and they frequently resorted to child theft. Small children were used by sweeps to descend narrow chimneys, especially the tight bends used in the chimney to obtain a better draught. The child was lowered from the top, scraping and sweeping whilst they were allowed to descend, the soot being collected at the bottom. Sweeps, as a form of promoting their services, used very small children and declared that they could sweep smaller chimneys than any other sweep. Bertie's mother heard an argument going on between a policeman and a sweep, vigorously holding on to a child. The sweep had heard shouting, "I know my rights. He's my child, and I'm defending and protecting him." The interested onlookers gathered around, some coming from within the public house. They heard the child calling out to its mother, whilst furiously trying to clamber into her arms. The crowd supported Martha, calling to the police officer to do his duty. And that decided it for the police officer who, taking the infant from the cart, returned the child to its parent, telling the sweep of a possible summons if he didn't keep quiet. When Bert's parents were asked to vacate Salem Gardens, they rented a house in Bayswater. It was here that he started kindergarten in 1892 at the age of 3. His starter class attached to the infant school was well attended. They were taught by senior girls aged 14, considered fit by their studies to consider teaching as a profession. Parents had to pay perhaps 4pence a week for the first child, then, on a sliding scale, less for additional children. The rate was flexible according to the parents' income. These fees were only just beginning to be stopped after an extra government grant for elementary education brought then into being. The minimum leaving age was 12 by the time Albert started school. The Education Act made attendance for all children compulsory. St. Matthew's Infant School, Poplar Place, Moscow Road, was a small church school for very young children, and it was to last for 2 years. There were no desks or individual seats, but galleries amounting to 8 rows of broad steps. He had to sing his multiplication tables and alphabet every morning. These were not the only form of learning by rote. There were others. Spectrum colours, kings and queens, months of the year, and many other useful facts had to be recited. Common words were learnt by heart and religiously checked every day by his teacher. Proper pronunciation of words, the correct use of grammar, national tunes, mental arithmetic, countries of the empire, all given a place in the curriculum. By the end of the 2-year period, a great deal was learnt, having to be committed to memory. Girl teachers, who were very patient and kind, understood how important it was that their charges could cope with the curriculum. His teachers were 14, the age when normal pupils left school. They were from the top class, who were in teacher training. There were no grants. Training had to be paid for by the parents, and there were beginning few jobs for girls. To be a nurse, the training was the same. The parents paid the fees. Some worked in local hospitals, but were not able to qualify without going on to college to receive their certificate. Bert was very happy at St. Matthew's School and did well, coming out top of the class. At his age, he began piano lessons, which he persevered with. Years later, achieved a professional standard. When Bert was 5, he transferred to the junior school of St. Matthew's Church, Acorn Road, the senior school being in Queen's Road. It was only the first class that had a separate room, known as the bottom standard. There, the pupils were taught the prayer book, to recite the 10 Commandments, the Creed, Catechism, and Lord's Prayer. This was to prepare them for confirmation. In subsequent years, the higher standards taught in a large hall, which seated about 5 classes. The head teacher was Mr. Dexter, who had an assistant and 3 female staff. Boys separated from girls, who had their own hall. Education was not compulsory. There was a voluntary charge made throughout the year of 2d per week for lessons. Discipline vigorously exercised to keep the noise levels down, so as not to disturb the other classes. Lessons arranged so that singing in one class taught with sewing or drawing in another. One would not affect the other. These large rooms, or halls, were very cold in the winter, for they had large windows and lofty ceilings. Each large room had a coal heater set in the middle of the floor, with the chimney pipe running up to the high roof. The wooden floor, uneven through use, showed raised nails and wooden knots. The splintered floor, scuffed by countless hobnail boots and dragged stools, gave off clouds of chalk dust when anyone moved. Colourless, flaking lime-washed walls peppered the surrounding floor, which added to the general dust. Even on still days, the sun's rays cast shimmering beams filled with dust particles upon the walls. Bertie spoke of the severe winters and dense fog, which made going to school something to be dreaded. In the winter of 1894-5, which was particularly severe, hot meals were provided and warm clothing and boots distributed to the needy. It was reported by a school's medical officer that at least 1/3 of all children had not had their clothes off for more than 6 months, and that a high percentage of these children had their underclothes sewn on them. Such children smelt, and nobody wanted to sit next to them. Others continually scratched and couldn't sit still. The schoolroom fumigated, and the teachers wore bags of sulphur sewn into their hems to ward off vermin. A great many children worked before and after school as messengers, street sellers, and errand boys. It was a case of having to provide for a single or sickly parent. For 12-year-old girls leaving school, domestic service was the most popular job available. Many of the children were fed by charitable funds provided by rich neighbours and philanthropists. It was only at the start of the First World War that the Board of Education compelled all authorities to provide meals. The health of school children was a matter of concern, and provision made for the medical inspection of all school children. By 1914, just over 3/4 of London's boroughs made health, eyesight and dental checks. The improved provision of continuous tap water helped children's health. Skin complaints began to disappear, and infections from various bugs reduced to the degree that fumigation tailed off. These were dreary winter days, when the teacher let the gas mantle held in the wall bracket, producing a depressing yellow glow. This light could hardly penetrate the gloom, not only because of the lateness of the hour, but the denseness of the London fog outside, which seeped into the room. Although it's difficult to picture the atmosphere, it is understandable when we consider their Mondays, a day when all the boilers in the street were lit for washing. It was difficult to breathe the sulphurous air, fires burning household waste, poor quality coal, fumes from candles, lamps burning a variety of oils, space heaters and carriage lamps. These all contributed to the poor quality of the air. To go out was a trial. One was continually tripping over milk churns and dustbins, negotiating horse dung and rotting waste into a pale golden-coloured world, with humps and bumps, pits and hillocks, ghostly bodies set lurching into each other, all groping to find their way along. The high-hung school bell, set upon the roof, rang at 9 and 1 o'clock. The children had to form up outside until let in, to form queues that were led snaking into the classrooms. There was no talking and no running. Every movement was regimented and orderly. Slates were used to write on, which made a squeaky noise when the slate pencils were used. No provision was made for cleaning the slates, so children spat on them and rubbed them with their sleeves. Slates hung from pegs around the wall were used for minor lessons and practice to save paper. When writing on slate perfected, writing books were issued with pen and ink sets passed out by the classroom monitor. By the turn of the century, a system of elementary education devised to educate some 2 million children who attended board schools. This was the direct result of the 1870 Education Act coming into fruition. England was divided into districts. Each district was set up with powers to levy rates and build schools. This was done, and the results can be seen today. Those schools are still in being, although perhaps not as schools anymore. The Education Act of 1902 was the basis for all branches of education, from elementary to university. Included in this were church schools, county schools, districts and borough councils, who formed local education committees, LEAs, and replaced school boards. By the end of 1902, 53 secondary schools were set up. It took a further 10 years to add 300 more. Albert was very aware that he was fortunate. His father had a skilled job that enabled him to be self-employed. His wife always ran her own business. The laundry operated from home and provided work for local women. And once again, it was an opportune time to own such an enterprise, especially in the middle-class area of Bayswater. It too prospered. This was a loving, secure home environment which provided him with a firm grounding for organisation and management. This was at a time when a number of events in both Britain and the rest of the world came one after another to create the industrial society. Steam engines invented to pump out water from the mines, allowing more minerals to be extracted. This power source was adapted to drive mills and traction engines. Canals operated to move heavy materials across country. Railways took over the transportation of goods and passengers. This movement of people stripped young people away from the countryside. New houses, factories, railway cuttings, tunnels and docks gave work to those leaving the countryside. To clothe, equip, furnish and supply the factories and their workers, ancillary businesses blossomed. And once this train of events happened, there was no stopping the development of the new industrial society, and it had far-reaching social results. If you were to see a film of London's population at the turn of the 19th century, you would be able to pick out those people who had a lot of money from those who had little. Their dress would give them away. The rich women wore long dresses made out of silks and satins, wore flamboyant hats and fur stoles, and carried a parasol. They didn't work, but ran their homes, planning the week's programme and meals, assisted by servants and cooks. Their husbands wore frock coats, bowl hats, and astrakhan-collared overcoats. Income tax was very low, allowing surplus money spent on clothes, houses, horses and carriages. It was a very unequal society. The poor children wore rags, went about barefooted, and were frequently undernourished. They lived in tenements and back-to-back houses with no sanitary arrangements, except a community lavatory and tap. Many children lived away from home, under bridges and populating derelict houses. All the different strata of society wore clothes appropriate to that level, not attempting to copy their so-called betters, but maintaining their stations in life. The rich looked upon the poor as unfortunates. Some socially minded individuals did so with embarrassment. Others felt guilt that there wasn't greater equality. The mass of the population were struggling with the day-to-day survival. 3/4 of all adults earned less than £160 a year. The gap between paying income tax or not widened during the Edwardian period. Almost 60% of the population were living more than two to a room. Many of these unfortunates were housed in the workhouse, on a diet of half a pint of milk and 5 ounces of dry bread for breakfast. Dinner, the main meal of the day, consisted of 1.5 ounces of fatty roast beef, 4 ounces of potatoes or other vegetables, and 6 ounces of some sort of pudding, usually a concoction of suet and flour. In addition, for supper, a half pint of water and milk mixed, of cocoa and a 1/4 pound of seed cake. This diet exceeded that of a worker's family whose wage might be 20 shillings a week. 30 shillings was considered a good wage. Alfred, a self-employed painter, earned about 40 shillings a week. Fortunately, these were times of feverish activity, industry and economically. Employment was high for Britain was preparing its defences, and the work demanded by the railways and house building kept the labour market busy. His working week was sometimes more than 50 hours, and even though employment was high, there was always a fear of the work drying up, of being out of work.